guys, it's Mr. G. Welcome back to American Traditions. So today we're talking about a very serious topic. We're talking about the Middle Passage and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And so to begin with, we're going to look back at the long history of slavery. Slavery, unfortunately, has existed since the dawn of humanity. Slavery dates back as far as human history goes, with accounts from the ancient Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, various Germanic tribes, African kingdoms, and even ancient Asian civilizations, all practicing some form of slavery. And so we know that slavery is a system or a practice of making a person into the property of another person, forcing them into a condition of servitude or bondage. If you're interested in digging deeper into some of these ancient stories, the historian Daniele Bolelli has a great podcast called History on Fire. He has a two-part series on the Roman slave wars about Spartacus and the slave rebellion. So if you ever have a moment, please check those out. They're really good. In our more recent past, we have to take a look at African slavery because, again, slavery has existed pretty much worldwide throughout human history. Abolitionism is pretty modern by historical standards. And so looking back at Africa, slavery was interkingdom, meaning that many slaves were taken prisoners from enemy tribes during times of war. Slaves would eventually be assimilated into the new tribe and into the new kingdom, and their kids would be born free. Right? This is a general rule. Now, obviously, there's many different kingdoms and tribes associated with Africa. Africa is a huge continent with a diverse population. But when we're talking about Africa, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, and this was the general way that things were done. African slavery was very different from what would come after in form of the transatlantic slave trade. But all slavery at times could be very brutal. And so really, it's in the age of exploration, the early 1500s, late 1400s, that we see European nations begin exploring the globe. As this is happening, Portugal establishes outposts in Africa. As they start trading with African kings and buying and selling goods, they also begin to buy slaves. And so most of the slaves that would come from Africa to the New World would come through these Portuguese ports. And so most of the slaves that would come out of the African slave trade would come from these Portuguese ports in Africa, places like Lagos, places like Gran Popo, and places like Porto Novo. So the question arises, why would Africans sell slaves to Europeans? Well, this deals with a couple different issues. First of all, the myth that Africans sold their own really isn't true, in the sense that Africans as a group of people did not exist. This trans-African movement really is born out of late stage colonialism. Most of the time, these tribes didn't consider themselves selling other Africans. They thought of it as selling members of another tribe or another ethnic group. And so most of these slaves were, again, prisoners of war or other outsiders to their society. Another thing to note is that as Europeans sold weapons and other industrial goods to these African kingdoms, it became very profitable for certain tribes to enter the slave trade as captors. As slavery shot off, we see this triangular trade begin to develop. And so the triangular trade goes between the 3 points of Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And so it's important to note that there was not a back and forth movement between all of these areas. The materials going back and forth between these 3 points varied depending on what the final destination was. See, between the Americas and Africa, Europeans were shipping finished goods, whereas the Americas were shipping raw materials back to Europe as well as back to the African coast. Whereas African slavery was going almost entirely to the Americas. As we can see here from these statistics, only about 2% of African slaves made their way to Europe. A slightly larger amount made their way to North America. The vast majority, and I mean the vast majority, we're talking about 93% here, went to either the Caribbean, Brazil, or Latin America, between those three groups. So most of the transatlantic slave trade really went to the Caribbean islands and Latin America. It's quite shocking when you see the numbers. The main reason for this is because Latin America and the Caribbean were the prime centers for plantations like the sugar plantations and for other resources. And so the thing about sugar is that it is a very hard job. It is disgustingly hard work cutting down sugar cane with a machete. It's incredibly tiring. You can work yourself to the bone doing it. And in the heat and the humidity of the Caribbean, it became unbearable. The average life expectancy for slaves in the Caribbean, places like Haiti and Cuba, the life expectancy for slaves during certain times of the year would even number in the days. We're talking about brutal working conditions. And so here we see another image of this triangular trade, this one really showing the nature of this transatlantic trade. When we look at the African diaspora, these numbers are quite shocking. We see that most Africans were brought to the Americas between the 17 and 1800s, with over 6 million individuals being brought over here. This number is large. So we saw that the vast majority of these African slaves made their way to Latin America, but it's also important to figure out the time that this happened. The transatlantic slave trade really hit its peak in the 1700s. This is the time when most African Americans ancestors made their way to what is now the United States, but this is also when the most African slaves made their way to the Americas as well. And so we really see that during the age of exploration from 1450 to 1600, there were very few numbers of African slaves taken compared to later on when over half are just within this 100-year slot. The African diaspora, the spreading out of African peoples all over the world, had a profound impact not only on demographics, but on culture and other institutions to come, as we'll see. Right? And here's a better image of this African diaspora. You could see that the vast majority of enslaved peoples are coming from West Central Africa, and they're going to places like Brazil, the Caribbean, with tiny little tendrils shooting off to the United States and to Europe. But this gives you a good image visually as to sort of the destination, but also the fate of these African slaves. As we know, the conditions on plantations like Saint Dominique, which would later become Haiti, and parts of Brazil, were incredibly harsh and led to the deaths of many slaves, which is why many were imported into these areas. And so the term that we give to the voyage between Africa and North America and the West Indies is the Middle Passage. This journey across the Atlantic actually led to many of the deaths of Africans before they even made it to the New World. Those who survived the Middle Passage would die from disease, they would die from exposure to the elements, they would die of starvation. It's really terrible the amount of life that was lost, in these horrible conditions. Down here on the right, we have a picture of the sleeping conditions on a slave ship, like the Amistad or other slave ships that were used. You're talking about very little space, horrible sanitary conditions. Enslaved peoples would go days without being able to get up to relieve themselves or even see light. And so that meant that they were urinating and defecating on themselves. The conditions below deck were absolutely atrocious, to say the least. Now, when it came to life for enslaved peoples, we know that the closer you were to arrival, the more likely you were to die. Death rates were incredibly high for newly arrived slaves compared to those who were born in the Americas. This is partially because you gained immunity from your family as each generation formed, as well as people became accustomed to the climate and the work conditions. That being said, most of the time, generally speaking, slaveholders in Latin America and the Caribbean really tried to minimize the amount of children born into slavery amongst populations. The reason being, the unfortunate reality was to these slavers, it was seen as much easier to buy and import slaves from Africa who were fully grown and able to work right away than to birth and rear children who would then grow up someday to work. This was different in North America, however, where the average slave owner did not own many slaves, and so it led to a different financial equation where it wasn't considered a negative to have a new generation of slaves be born because those could be passed on or sold for wealth. It's the sad nature of the system. That being said, there was resistance to slavery. It came in many forms, but oftentimes resistance was so brutally punished that it deterred future rebellions. That being said, there were armed rebellions. These were rarely successful, the most successful being Haiti. Obviously, Haiti became a free country due to their slave rebellion. But most of the time, we saw this in the form of runaway slaves, slowdowns, faking illness, things like that to slow down the workforce and hit the slave owners' pocketbooks. A big form of resistance to slavery would come in the form of strong communities, family communities, faith communities. All these were seen as a way to resist the degradation and the dehumanization of the enslavement process. In some extreme cases, there were enslaved peoples who would commit suicide or jump off the ship during the Middle Passage in order to resist becoming a part of the system. When we talk about slavery, we're oftentimes talking about a thing in the past, something that happened that we hope would never happen again. We unfortunately sometimes fail to recognize that even nowadays, while slavery doesn't look like the chattel slavery of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, it does unfortunately still exist. Modern day slavery or human trafficking exists all across the world. It's estimated that there are between 20 and 40 million people currently enslaved today. An estimated 10 million of those turn out to be children or teenagers. That means every minute on this earth, 3 children on average are kidnapped and forced into sex trafficking or other human trafficking. Modern slavery has a very different look. It's not this chattel slavery, this owning of another person in the same way that it was legal to own another person in the early days of colonization and our republic. Modern day slavery takes on many different forms. Some people are forced into domestic servitude. We see this a lot in the United States where a person comes over on a visa and then has their documents taken from them and is forced to work in the homes of other people with no option to be able to leave or go back to their home country. We also see forced labor, where human beings are forced to work under threat of violence for no pay. We see this currently happening in China with Uyghur Muslims, where they are literally being put into concentration camps and work because of their faith. We see sex trafficking is a very common form of modern slavery, where women and children and even some men are kidnapped and forced into prostitution. Unfortunately, Florida is one of the hotbeds for sex trafficking trade in the United States. And lastly, there's bonded labor. Human beings are put into a debt slavery where they're forced to work off their balance and basically they can never get ahead and they are forever indebted to their debtor. I don't bring this up to cause despair. There are groups out there doing great work. And so a way that we can help is to get active with non-governmental organizations, groups like the Polaris Project, Anti-Slavery International, Catholic Relief Services, and many more. If you know somebody who might be the victim of sex trafficking or human trafficking, there's a National Human Trafficking Resource Center as well as a free hotline that you can call. Another thing that you can do is write your representative or senator and have them help to pass legislation that cracks down on modern day slavery. That's all I got for you guys today. I hope you found this lesson informative and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. If you haven't hit that like button, go ahead and do that. If you haven't hit that bell to get notifications, go ahead and do that too. My name is Mr. G and I'll see you next time.